They say people are socialists in their 20s, but grow into capitalism as they grow into adulthood. Among my demographic, it's trendy to be a tanky or a commie or socialist or progressive or rad lib or Stalinist or Marxist-Leninist, whatever other self-proclaimed leftist title I might have overlooked. Now, there are minor differences, and there is infighting between these subgroups, but what's important is that they are all fundamentally collectivist, and they lead to human suffering. Capitalism is the single most successful, prosperous, egalitarian, and robust economic system in human history. A system whose mechanisms produce optimal social and economic outcomes from the accumulated self-interested actions of individuals. The alternatives like socialism, like communism, feudalism, fascism, or anarchism, they pale in comparison. We can judge a system's relative effectiveness if it serves more people, the same number of people more efficiently, or at a higher quality. But the system must also not violate the human rights of those not within the system. So let's knock off the easiest. Anarchism. Anarchism describes a society where no power structures exist, no government, no state, no nation. A stateless, powerless society is vulnerable to the next nation over. It will be promptly flattened, as the anarchist society is defenseless. There needs to be some form of mediation between the interactions of people. Organization and specialization is beneficial for society. Anarchism by definition lacks those virtues. Next up, feudalism. Another easy one on the list. Feudalism is a system where the noble class own the land and peasants work the land for the right to live on it and subsist off the yields of that land. Any excessive value peasants pulled off of the land went straight to the nobles. The outgroup, the serfs, vastly outnumbered the nobles. They lived lives of multi-generational indentured servitude with no social or economic mobility. It's easy to recognize why feudalism no longer exists in the civilized world today. Let's now examine fascism. Despite the meme of the Nazi Party being far-right authoritarians, history tells us the opposite. The Nazis were a leftist movement. The party name, after all, was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. They advocated state-controlled healthcare, profit-sharing for workers and large corporations, death penalty for moneylenders, state control of education, of media and the press, of banks and industries, state control of religious expression, and seizure of land without compensation. It's important to realize that ideologies that are similar very frequently do go to war. Catholics versus Protestants, Shia versus Sunni. Why do they fight? Competitions over territory and power, and so on. Hitler was a National Socialist. The reason Hitler hated the communists was not because they were socialist. He liked that part about them. He didn't like that they were taking their orders from Moscow. He saw them as traitors to Germany. Hitler's priority was socialism in Germany. The fact that they warred against each other in no way refutes the idea that progressivism, communism, fascism, Nazism are all similar. They are dissimilar in how we treat them culturally. Nazism has become the proverbial cultural evil. Someone says Nazi, you think evil. After all, they killed 6 million Jews. That is evil. Given the unparalleled murder of over 100 million, why isn't communism held in the same regard? Fascism is both an economic and political system. It's a radical extension of nationalism. Nationalism isn't wholly bad, but when it turns bad, it almost always morphs into some form of fascism. Fascism is an all-encompassing state control of all social systems. The common political groups in America that are labeled fascist, like the alt-right, do not meet the proper definition of fascism, though a minority of very specific people may have talking points borrowed from fascism. More than often, this label is incorrectly used to silence political dissent. Under fascism, individual rights are only respected so long as they align with the state. There is nothing built into this economic system that prevents the state from turning on its own citizenry when it's beneficial for them to do so. They believe, like capitalists, hierarchical social Darwinism is beneficial to society. But they also believe, like communism, that the state has a fundamental role to play in managing economic interactions. Fascism fails in economic terms because those within the group, citizens of the state, do not benefit economically from being within the group. and it obviously results in atrocities for the minority outgroups. And here's where we get to the fun comparisons. Let's get to socialism. The reason why so many Americans are self-prescribed socialists nowadays is because they view it as more moral. Not that it works or that it is great, but that it is more fair. If one person has more money and the other has less money, wouldn't it be more fair if they shared it so they both had equal amounts? This idea doesn't work in reality and isn't actually fair or moral. Wealth is contingent on the decisions you make. Most wealth is not inherited. It's created in the course of a lifetime by people who engage in trade. Make no mistake, socialism is tyranny. The idea that your labor is owed to society. You do not own your own time. You don't own your own labor. You do not own your own work. You do not own your own products to your own work. It is immoral to steal from people, even if you vote to steal from people, like in democratic socialism. Socialism is considered the stepping stone for a society transitioning from capitalism to communism. It is defined by the social ownership of the means of production. In capitalism, capital is owned by a single or a small group of owners who employ workers to produce products with the help of the capital in exchange for a wage. The owner exchanges the products produced by the workers with the use of the capital for profit. That profit is then used to maintain the capital, provide a wage for the workers, and pay the owner for the ownership of the capital. And his worth is in directing the production, hiring and firing of workers, and negotiating of sales within the marketplace. Socialists believe this setup is inherently unethical. The means of production cannot be privately owned, that it must be socially owned. Socialists believe all humans to be unchangingly equal in their capacity to work. It does not believe in growth through effort or entrepreneurship. Socialism talks about rights but not responsibility, about alleviating suffering but not about creating wonders. A lot of the objections to fascism apply to socialism because they are both forms of state control. Therefore, they are prey to the same folly. The limited knowledge of a state making decisions for the economy is minuscule compared to the near infinite aggregation of knowledge from all individual participants in the system making choices for themselves. A major source of objection to a free economy is precisely that it gives people what they want instead of what a particular group thinks they ought to want. Underlying most arguments about the free market is the lack of belief in freedom itself. Socialism by its very nature is doomed to fail. Socialist thinkers usually present social transformations as the solution to social and market ails. In their opinion, the capitalist economic dynamic is the source of said ails. Once market relations are transformed, it is assumed the system would be open for rule by the collective, in the interests of the whole. Under these fairy tale circumstances, there then would be no need for a state government, nor for the concept of money. These thinkers say very little about political institutions and how to check their power. The problem of abuse of power would no longer need to be considered. Unfortunately, for any society, there will always be interests vying for advantages for themselves. Socialism assumes or hopes such problems would not arise. Socialism ignores the problem of institutionalizing a socialist order without a dictatorship by the political elite. They have no legitimate response to the phrase, "and if I refuse?" It's pretty clear the socialist is ignorant regarding the nature of humanity. Socialism is too bogged down by its own bureaucracy to make expedient economic decisions. It provides no safeguards for state corruption and fails to recognize excellence or poor performance. Lastly, communism. The critiques of socialism apply to communism because the two are very similar, but there are a few key distinctions. Socialism advocates co-ownership of the means of production, while communism advocates the communal ownership of the means of production. Of course, in practice, they both result in state ownership because the state ends up being the only legitimate representative of the people, but at least the theory is different. Secondly, socialism advocates equalizing all classes by demoting the upper class, while communism advocates for removing the upper class through violent revolution. Commies believe all hierarchies are based on power. Meritocracies do not exist. They are simply masquerading as power hierarchies. I'll admit, power can corrupt meritocratic hierarchies, so much so that they cease to function, but it's not reasonable to say hierarchies of merit within the Western socio-economic system have been compromised to that degree. I'll let Jordan Peterson explain this one for me.
One thing that I've been doing in my tour repeatedly, when I talk about the first chapter of my book, which is Stand Up Straight with Your Shoulders Back, it's a discussion of hierarchies and their eternal nature, right? Because my claim is, and it's not my claim, I think it's mere fact, that organisms that have to cooperate and compete with other organisms of their type inevitably arrange themselves into hierarchies, and that's been going on for so long, which is at least 300 million years, that our nervous systems have adapted to hierarchies as if they're a permanent element of being, right? More permanent than trees, like seriously permanent. The most fundamental neurochemical, the one that regulates the entire brain, serotonin, is acutely sensitive to hierarchical distinctions. And so that's part of the proposition. So the reason I laid that proposition forward was to say, whatever pitfalls hierarchies might produce, you cannot lay them at the feet of the West, patriarchy, or capitalism. It's like, that's a non-starter. You're wrong. And not just a little bit wrong. You're so seriously wrong that if you insist upon doing that, you won't even achieve your own aims. Because you're actually not grappling with the problem. The problem is, if hierarchies are a problem, which they are, the problem is way more serious than mere capitalism. It's way deeper. And if you're actually interested in rectifying the negative consequences of hierarchies, then you're going to have to get a lot more sophisticated than your idiot Marxism. So part of the elaboration of that argument is, well, hierarchies are inevitable because we have to solve complex problems and we have to solve them socially. And when you implement a solution to a complex problem socially, you produce a hierarchy because some people are better at the implementation than others. So there's a hierarchy of competence, and then there's a hierarchy of distribution of the spoils. And in both of those hierarchies, you get a disproportionate clumping of resources at the top and dispossession at the bottom. It's in the nature of hierarchies. So what's the left for? The left is to remind those who are benefiting from the hierarchies that the hierarchy comes at a cost. And the cost is the clumping of people at the bottom. And that's an eternal cost, and it's not trivial. And so that's what the left should be properly focused on. The left should be providing the voice of those who are dispossessed by hierarchies. And the right should be saying, yeah, but the damn hierarchies are necessary. And they're not only necessary, but they're also productive. Then the left says, yes, but they tilt towards tyranny, and they can be occupied inappropriately by people who are playing games of power. Fair enough, the right has to take that into account. The hierarchy can rigidify and is likely to do that, and it can be taken over by people who are corrupt, and that's likely to happen. And so, but it's okay because the dialogue can work out. The right can say, well, yeah, we need the damn hierarchies and they need to be buttressed, and the left can say, yes, but they have to be maintained properly so they don't deteriorate and degenerate. And I think that's ancient wisdom. I think the ancient Egyptians had figured that out in their symbolic representations. So now, when the left goes too far, it does something like say, well, how about no hierarchies? It's like, no, how about not? Wrong. Because all that happens one of the things that happens if you flatten out the hierarchy is that you can't even organize your perceptions. You can't perceive the world without looking at the world through a hierarchy of value. And because you can't perceive the world unless you make one thing more important than all the other things, because you don't even know what to look at. And if one thing isn't more important than all the other things, then you have nothing to aim at. If you have nothing to aim at, then you have no meaning in your life. So the left can't just demolish the hierarchies in the name of some equality of outcome, let's say, because you blow out the future, you leave people aimless, and you destroy the very institutions that allow people to make competent progress in the world. That's not an acceptable outcome. So we have to agree to live with the tension. Necessity for hierarchies, the proclivity for them to pathologize, and the necessary voice of the left in speaking for the dispossessed.
The fact that you're able to listen to my voice on whatever device you're using is, to some degree, evidence that this meritocratic system still provides value. We have things like water, power, heat, food, transportation, technology, and so on, all the time that we take for granted every day. Communism claims to want to upend the hierarchies of power for the betterment of the working class. But why did tens of millions of Ukrainians starve to death under Stalin's communist Russia? People crawled into wheat fields to eat ears of wheat before dropping dead. They died from hunger in the act of eating. Children collapsed and died during lessons. A mother took the bread from her offspring to feed her husband. She could always have more kids, but she could only have one husband. A couple put their children in a deep hole and left them there as to not watch them die. A father strangled his own children rather than watch them perish from hunger. Communities that had once been kind and welcoming became mistrustful and violent. Lynch mobs tortured people. In the end, most horrifically of all, people began to eat each other. How could this have happened? If communism cares for the well-being of the poor, why did the genocide of millions in Ukraine happen? The bourgeoisie in communism are responsible for not just oppressing the proletariat, but also preventing the utopia from coming about. That's a great rationalization for any punishments communism may inflict upon them. The bourgeoisie are the ones at the top of the hierarchies of power, and all hierarchies are hierarchies of power, even when they're not. In Russia, the people at the top of the meritocratic farming hierarchy were serf families, few generations ago, but were exceptionally good at farming that capitalized on the recent dissolution of the feudalism due to them being the most competent farmers in the nation. With communism obsession with upending hierarchies, it slaughters all of those farmers, and the state is left with no one who knows how to grow food. Was this the case of well-intentions but unintended consequences that resulted in the planned starvation of millions? I don't think so. The underlying motive of many communists is a hypertrophied sense of order. The present imperfect state of affairs offends them not because it causes misery, but because it is untidy. Poverty, and what is more, the habits of mind created by poverty, are to be abolished from above, by violence if necessary. Perhaps even preferably by violence. The truth is that to many communists, revolution does not mean a movement of the masses with which they hope to associate themselves. It means a set of reforms which we, the clever ones, are going to impose upon them, the lower orders. It'd be a mistake to regard a commie as a bloodless creature incapable of emotion. Though they seldom give much evidence of affection for the downtrodden, they are capable of displaying a peculiar hatred against the exploiters. It's ironic to watch any tankie rage against the class to which, by birth or adoption, they invariably belong to. 9 out of 10 Antifa live with their parents. A survey on Reddit's r/socialism found 48% of the frequenters were unemployed, 61% live with their parents, and only 14% support free speech. To anyone that spends any attention on the internet, especially blue checkmarks on Twitter, this person is extremely familiar. They even have a term for it, champagne socialist. These people do not care about the poor or the marginalized. They simply hate the rich. Every time we consider a failed socialist or communist state, you can hear lefties screeching that it wasn't true socialism. What they don't understand is that socialism requires state tyranny, because the owners of the means of productions are not going to give up their property willingly. Their property must be stolen from them at the threat of government gunpoint. You cannot trust anyone who says true socialism or communism has never been tried. The implication is that all who have tried were morally deficient, and that they, the speaker, somehow have the inhuman morality to make communism work. They don't. They're humans who are neither wholly good nor wholly evil, and would be corrupted by the absolute power necessary to make such a system attempted. It fails the same reason socialism fails. It fails to provide for its in-group. It fails to account for political excess, and fails to account for the hatred of the rich rather than the love for the poor. The communists believe two people choosing to exchange their labor for money is inherently exploitative, because the person choosing to exchange their labor doesn't have a choice. They are driven by necessities. Necessities of food, of water, of shelter, or of healthcare. If we're being honest, any commodity will suffice as reason enough. They believe labor and production is a zero-sum game. Any exchange for a commodity that is needed is exploitative. They believe if a person adds labor to a commodity, the value of said commodity increases. This is obviously not true. You can buy ingredients for a pizza, assemble the pizza, burn it to a crisp because you're a bad cook, and produce a meal with less value than the sum of its uncooked components. In communism, all labor adds value to commodities. Now, let's for a second imagine a valet at an expensive hotel, and he's paid $15 an hour and works 10 hours, so he makes $150 a day. Let's say he parks 100 cars a day. The hotel charges every car $30 for valet. As a result, the hotel makes $3,000 minus the wage of $150, so $28.50 profited off the back of the valet's labor, right? Not quite. The hotel still has to pay the costs of maintaining the hotel and staff, but eventually we get some number of what Marx would call surplus value. Marx's rhetorical question is this: who gets surplus value? His assertion is that it 100% belongs to the labor, because labor made the goods. Consider the capitalist. He supplies a lot to the business, but does not supply capital. The capitalist supplies three things far greater than capital that entitles him to a share of the surplus value. Marx willingly ignores these 3 points. 1. The idea for the business. Without the idea, the business would not exist. 2. Organization. The reason the valet receives $15 an hour to park the car is because he is working for a fancy hotel. Someone built the hotel, thought of it, organized maintenance, took out insurance, etc. If the valet wasn't working for a fancy place, he might be parking people's cars in a neighborhood for $1 a car. The labor isn't worth $30. It's the valet at the resort that is worth $30. The valet did not create that. Third, the risk. The capitalist gets paid at the end. If the business has a bad quarter, the capitalist can't tell the valet, sorry, you're not getting paid for a few months. Labor is trading fixed wage for security. The entrepreneur takes that risk that he might be getting nothing in return for his labor, or he might even be losing money. The value theory of labor is preposterous. Value of labor is determined by voluntarily trading that labor for someone else's labor on the market. This has to be the case in order for the exchange to be non-exploitative. When difference in quality becomes the issue, quality as a concept must be removed from the discussion. This is why communism can only bring people and products down to the lowest common denominator. There are differences in skill, and the only way for everyone to be fair and equal is to kneecap the ones at the higher end of the skill curve. You can't force untalented people to have talent, but you can force talented people to be underutilized. Usually this is achieved through blood, in the millions. The least productive, the proletariat, are venerated and whipped to work as hard as they can, lest they waste the people's labor, while the most productive lowered themselves voluntarily in order to survive, or were lowered forcefully through systematic abuse or by slaughter, under the guise of being the bourgeoisie. Communist nations survive for a few decades feeding off the previous success of capitalism, but communism is ultimately decay, and eventually those countries fall into economic ruin and collapse. There are 4 ways which you can spend money. You can spend your own money on yourself. When you do that, you really watch out for what you're doing, and you try to get the most out of that money. You can spend the money on someone else. For example, buying a present for someone. Well then, you might not be so careful about the content of the present, but at least you're careful about the cost. You can also spend someone else's money on yourself. If you spend someone else's money on yourself, then you're going to make sure that you have a good lunch. And lastly, you can spend someone else's money on someone else. If you spend someone else's money on someone else, you're not concerned about how much it costs, and you're not concerned about what they get. That's government. Let's say you're walking on the street and you just bought yourself a big, tasty sandwich. Someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, I'm really hungry. I don't have any money. Could you give me some of your sandwich?" You agree to share a portion with him. This is virtuous. It is a virtuous transaction. First, because you're a good person for sharing, and the recipient of the gift, he feels gracious. Maybe later they'll share a sandwich with someone else. But let's consider the government is involved. You say no. In a sense, you're not doing anything wrong. It is your sandwich. If the hungry person doesn't get it, they are not worse off than they were before. But something interesting happens. You hear galloping. The president rides up to you on a white horse. dismounts, puts a gun to your head, and says, "Hand me that sandwich." He grabs half the sandwich, takes a big bite, a lot of it falls on the ground. Then he hands a portion to the hungry man. The outcome is the same as earlier, except in this scenario, you are the reluctant giver. You weren't going to hand over the sandwich if it weren't for the threat of force. You deserve no credit. The guy who gets a piece, far from feeling appreciative, feels entitled. Only this small piece of the sandwich, where's the rest? I'm hungry. The same transaction that would be virtuous if it were voluntary in the private sphere becomes monstrous. If you weren't the president and tried galloping up to someone with a gun to their head, you'd be considered a villain. And yet the same banditry is legitimized and considered noble because it's the government doing it. Ultimately, if you refuse, they will do nothing less than shoot you. What the communist doesn't understand is that necessity isn't a function of capitalism. It's a function of reality. Everyone needs food, needs water, healthcare, walls and a roof over their head, but they're all finite commodities that come at a cost to create. You must provide for others in order to be provided for things in return. Anything less is theft. In the end, communism is an excuse to justify the desire to steal labor from the people who spent decades earning it. The worst thing a society can do is tell the exceptional among them that their skills, talents, education, ideas, or hard work will no longer be rewarded. A person who became rich and did it fairly is not immoral. In fact, I'm arguing the opposite. The luxuries you are experiencing today are a function of capitalism. If it weren't for capitalism, you'd still be in the fields plowing crops as most people did 100 years ago. The ideals of capitalism are responsible for the greatest reduction in human misery in history. 80% of the world's poverty since 1970 has decreased, and as markets become more and more free, this trend is only accelerating. One need only to look at the results each ideology produces. Wherever Marx's ideas were put into practice, life got worse for those people. There is not a single exception to that rule. Not the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Zimbabwe. Wherever Marxism goes, economic collapse, terror, murder, famine follow. What follows capitalism? Surplus of food, reductions in suffering, technological innovation, luxury we couldn't have fathomed a century ago. And let's be clear, Scandinavian countries are not socialist. Denmark's own prime minister was so fed up with Americans pointing to it as a beacon of successful socialism, he felt compelled to clarify. I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. The Scandinavian countries are capitalist, but their government have instituted stifling high tax rates, particularly on the middle class, in order to pay for welfare benefits that are slowly failing. Private schools and hospitals are beginning to outcompete the old failing state projects. In Denmark, Social Security has gone extinct in favor of private plans like 401ks. In Scandinavia, there is less red tape and stronger property rights than almost anywhere else in the world. There are no minimum wage laws in Denmark. Individuals create wealth, and state spending produces decay. But this decay takes time, and sometimes growth can outpace that decay. The likes of Sweden and Denmark are able to bear the burden of decay because of their historical free market success in the 20th century. They are slowly realizing their welfare state is not sustainable, as their welfare institutions are slowly collapsing. Again, capitalism produces wealth. Then the state spends that wealth and produces little of value in return. What has capitalism produced? Take a look at this graph Jonathan Haidt called the most important graph in the world. There is no substitute for free market capitalism as a promoter of human prosperity. Haidt is a liberal professor of psychology at NYU, by the way. GDP is the best measurement for the world's standard of living. Yes, the wealthy got wealthier. We made them rich. The inequality socialists complain about is the result of popular mandate. We all voted to make them rich with our wallets. Market economies involve a level of participation and democratic consent that politics can only envy. If you want fewer billionaires, stop buying their stuff. If you like Facebook, Google, Instagram, Venmo, iPhone, Android, MacBooks, PCs, Kindle, Netflix, Amazon, Spotify, Uber, Airbnb, or YouTube, you like capitalism because they all came from entrepreneurs who were able to test their ideas in the free market. Compare those services to USPS, the DMV. Have you ever gone through the airport security? or called any government office, you quickly learn the government should not be involved with any product or service that can be fulfilled by private institutions. Profit-motivated individuals have to provide value to please their customers. The government does not. It uses money that isn't theirs to provide a service or product that they are not held accountable for. But rich getting rich and poor getting poorer is a hoax in and of itself. The middle class and poor are getting richer faster. Even the poor in America live better than the rich did 50 years ago. In 1820, 94% of people lived in extreme poverty. Thanks to capitalism, by 2015 that number has plummeted to 9.6. Since 1990, hunger, poverty, illiteracy, child mortality, they have all declined with the decline of socialism. The most rapid falls in poverty are happening in countries that are joining the global trading system, who have rule of law, property rights, and free trade. Removing barriers to trade means prices fall, and poverty falls with it. More people, billions less impoverished, better health outcomes and standards of living, fewer babies dying are among a few of the long lists of benefit capitalism has produced. I already know the cliché detractors will use of listing slavery and colonialism among a few of the most egregious evils capitalism is responsible for. What do they have to do with capitalism? Let's take slavery. Coercing the labor of another human being isn't capitalism. Capitalism requires consent of transactions. In the same way, colonialism, political conquest by force, are both antitheses to capitalism. Why does capitalism work? Unlike any other system, it accounts for individual liberty. Of course, there are still poor and homeless and starving people within the system. With capitalism, those people at least have the opportunity and freedom of choice to climb the economic hierarchy. Capitalism is a hierarchy of merit to which a person's success depends on two factors: effort and time invested. In communism, the needs of the individual directly oppose the needs of the state. The individual would like to reap the benefit of their labor, while the state would like to redistribute the benefit of that labor equally. In fascism, success isn't rewarded, but failure was punished in the name of the collective. Capitalism rewards success, but does not punish failure, because we recognize economic failure is punished in and of itself. The needs of the people and the state are aligned. It's in everyone's best interest for the individual to benefit from his labor, but it's also beneficial for the state due to wider benefit of trade among other individuals. The impetus to craft a video on this topic stemmed from a conversation I had with a friend. During said conversation, the other party was hung up on the concept of value. I had to detangle value, in the economic sense, from intrinsic human value. The two are very different, but are not unrelated. I've already explained economic value, so on to human value. The idea that human beings have inherent value springs from the Christian idea that we're all equal before God. That comes from the idea that as human beings we are created as individuals, made in the likeness of God, and therefore we have to value the rights of other human beings. These moral structures were what provided the grounding for a social fabric that allowed freedom to flourish. It is therefore no surprise. Enlightenment was exclusive to Western civilization, the only civilization at the time or since that values individual rights before God. With the Enlightenment came classical liberal thinkers, the likes of which formalized ideas about freedom. Examples include Adam Smith for the free market, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes for natural human rights, Baron de Montesquieu for his writings on the separations of powers and on republics, Voltaire for freedom of religion, Jean-Jacques Rousseau on social Western tradition, Marquis de Condorcet on constitutionalism and equality under the law. I'd like to focus on John Locke's idea of natural rights. He postulated that, because of our intrinsic worth, all humans have negative rights. Negative rights are rights that cost nothing to violate. Positive rights, or entitlements, are no rights at all. An example of a non-right is the quote right to healthcare. Healthcare is a combination of services and products. You have no right to forcibly take the fruits of someone else's labor. That's why food isn't a right, water is not a right, housing isn't a right, education is not a right, free sneakers, they are not rights. The penultimate negative right is the right to life. All other rights are derivations. You have the right to liberty and equality under the law because you have the right to live as you deem fit, so long as you do not infringe on someone else's rights. This is where the two values are interconnected. We are all born with intrinsic value, and thus have human rights and freedoms. Liberty and the right to property means we are free to trade our time in the form of labor in exchange for a product. The larger and more frequent you conduct consensual exchanges, the more economic value you have provided for yourself and for others. Still don't get it? To anyone who has ever taken basic economics, there is a concept of the creation of value that you should be familiar with. When it costs me $1 to create a product, let's call it product A, but $100 to produce product B, but the costs are flipped for you, I can trade A for B, and all of a sudden I've gained $99 in value by helping you also gain $99 in value. At the fundamental level, this is how all economic value is produced. Value is not a zero-sum game hoarded by the uber-rich. Instead, value is generated by honest trade. Hard work and innovation can generate new value. Money is simply a medium that value is represented through. It allows you to defer and store the success of participating in the non-zero-sum game of value creation. Money is a general metric that may indicate how many people you have benefited. This is the morality of money. If your business is successful, you've spent a lot of your time creating value for other people. Many people are using that product, and their lives are improved by its use. Free market capitalism is simply this: the consensual transaction of products or services between two or more parties. Anything involuntary is against one's will and is evil. In this system, you must provide something of benefit for the other party, or the transaction will not occur. In order to gain value for yourself, you must be of benefit to another. It's what Ayn Rand means when she makes the claim that self-interest is the highest moral purpose. CEOs, athletes, and investors generate a lot of income because of the sheer magnitude of lives they affect. A teacher with a class size of 40 every year for 50 years will only affect 2,000 students. Even though the value she provides is very important, the sheer volume of people in the entertainment industry or a CEO of a mega corporation that they impact more than makes up for the diminished impact in terms of total value added to others' lives, and thus they are paid more. Having more money probably means you have helped more people through your work. I say probably because there are a few instances where this isn't the case. Theft, false advertising, and corporate cronyism, to name a few. Stealing violates the natural human right to own property. This one is obvious. False advertising violates the consensual clause of free markets. If I agree to transact for A, but I receive C instead, it's no better than theft. Corporate cronyism. When companies collude together to price gouge consumers and receive special deals from corrupt politicians for financial gain. Crony capitalism is a misnomer. In all honesty, what is going on here is fascist economics. The government uses the taxpayer dollars to fund friends, supporters, and themselves. They pick economic winners and losers in the interest of the state. In a free market, a corporation will fail if it does not please the people it serves. The most recent example of fascist economics comes from the anti-constitutional, anti-freedom government lockdowns and COVID mandates. They've resulted in this century's largest reduction in small businesses. The work, resultant product, and laborers were deemed as non-essential, based not on science, but based on political clout and on connections. There's been a 48% jump in bankruptcies across the nation. Simultaneously, the Federal Reserve took action to support the stock market. And the biggest companies, the types of entities that already had access to capital, as well as years of access to cheap debt. This meant trillions of dollars created at the stroke of a digital entry by the Fed. It was pumped into the market. This enabled big companies and their shareholders to get more value, while destroying risk pricing in small businesses. Those with power, wealth, and clout were protected, told they mattered and that they were essential. They then reaped significant financial benefits, the likes we have never seen in history. Every time I consider this topic, I am reminded of Peter Schiff's viral YouTube video during the Occupy Wall Street protest. He himself is a millionaire. The video is over 100 minutes of him speaking to protesters, listening to them protest without actually understanding what they were protesting about. Schiff actually agrees to the concerns of the protesters, but disagrees with the consensus solution. He argues that their complaints should fall at the feet of the Federal Reserve and on Congress, because they have the power to compel, with threat of force, economic winners and losers through regulation, through subsidization, through bailouts, protesting the free market businesses who happen to benefit from corrupt policies enacted by a far too powerful government is misguided. It's all emotion with no basis in facts or how the system operates. Anyone who knows me well knows I hold contempt for almost no one. This is not the case for two groups of people, the mainstream media and certain branches of the government. I'd like to discuss the latter, more specifically, the Federal Reserve. What many of you may or may not understand is that in the United States, the dollar is a currency based entirely on the trust in government. Trust that the dollar will remain stable. The Fed, with the help of the Treasury, controls the supply of dollars and can print as many bills as they deem necessary. Every time they print money and pay themselves with it, the worth of your individual dollar becomes diminished. Make no mistake, you are being taxed more than once. If you're in the top tax bracket, you get to keep 60 cents for every dollar you earn. Then the government pays itself by adding more dollars, so that 60 cents drops in value to maybe 50 cents. They just taxed you an additional 10% without you even knowing. The Fed is reckless with this behavior and is directly responsible for every single economic depression in the past 100 years. The cause of the Great Depression was the unseen failure of government policy and action. The same can be said about the recent crash in '08 and every downturn in between. We are the largest debtor nation in all of history at nearly $30 trillion. That debt will soon become unsustainable. The Federal Reserve is operating quite literally the greatest Ponzi scheme of all time. With the failures and thievery of the Federal Reserve in mind, I am optimistic about decentralized cryptocurrencies. The long march of technology always wins. Governments have been equally shitty throughout history. What do I fundamentally trust more? Not organizations made of people, but I trust technology. Crypto will improve year over year. When the Fed arbitrarily prints free money whenever they feel like it, people will ask, where's the money coming from? Who gets it? Who has the authority to create and give away money? Why do those guys have access to free money and not me? Minting Bitcoin is a crowdsourced hash rate competition. Everyone can equally participate. And I love seeing this competition. The Fed has their work cut out for them when it comes to the dollar being competed against by a more fair, more secure, more private cryptocurrency. Economic markets and currencies are just one facet of freedom. The history of the world has been a long, arduous up and down trudge towards prosperity and liberty by the means of technology. I'm excited for what future has in store for me and for generations to come. And remember, the freer the markets, the freer the people. Thanks for watching.